Okay, good afternoon all. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon. So we're looking at a webinar as titled on the slide about delivering a well-architected Power Platform solution. You would have also seen it registered as Architecture Best Practices for Power Platform. So essentially we're going to be focusing in on the Power Platform and focusing on Microsoft's well-architected solutions. Initially, we'll look at the agenda. If we can move on to the next slide. So for awareness, this session will be recorded and it will be uploaded and available on YouTube. So if you haven't managed to catch all of it, you can catch back up later on YouTube. Essentially, in terms of our agenda, we're going to run through some introduction shortly, understand who we are on the call and understand who Valto is. We're then going to look at two components of building out the Power Platform. So initially, the pre-development processes. So we're going to look at what goes into specifying and scoping a Power App that needs to be built. We'll then be looking at what Power Platform well-architected is, models that can be used for a well-architected Power Platform, as well as jump into a live demonstration of how some of those practices are put into place. Finally, we'll have a look at how we can help you, and we'll take any questions at the end. Just as a note, you will have access to the question and answer panel. So if you do want to raise any questions throughout the presentation, if you can please just enter them into there, they'll be reviewed and we'll pick them up and answer them as many as we can at the end of the session. Next slide, please, Dave. Excellent. So firstly, well, who is Valto? So Valto was founded back in 2017, and we do everything Microsoft. So we're fully Microsoft house. We do everything Microsoft 365. We've been growing from strength to strength since 2017. We're now up to nearly about 50 employees in the organization. We do everything from consultancy to support to development, so everything across the Microsoft platform. We look to help various different clients, big and small, across all different industry areas, to deliver them, more efficient workplaces using the Microsoft tools that are available to them. We actually split into 5 different pillars. We've got our modern workplace. So our modern workplace focuses on intranets, focuses on teams, leave request systems, contract management systems, etc. So anything to kind of improve communications, improve the way that the workforce works efficiently with one another, from SharePoint to Viva, and all Microsoft solutions that are in place there. We also offer our managed services pillar. So we offer support across all of our other varying pillars that are in place. So if we develop an intranet, then we will also support an intranet for you. But we do also offer traditional IT support as well. And we also support users with their licensing requirements and provide them to our clients. We have Microsoft 365 and Azure. So we look at putting together secure practices into organizations, moving people across into the Azure public cloud, ensuring their devices and their infrastructure is secure, and help people move away from kind of current file share and file server environments and kind of environments of old organizational ways of working, and move people and modernize them into the cloud environments. We have business applications. Business applications is what today's webinar is focused on, and that's very much focused around the Power Platform. So that's anything from our Power Apps to Power BI to Power Automate. So we develop a number of bespoke solutions, as well as develop solutions that we deploy out to various organizations. So as I said, today's webinar is very much focused around the business application side of our organization. And then finally, we've got our newest pillar. Our newest pillar covers data and AI practices. Obviously, this aligns with all the great stuff that Microsoft is now doing with Microsoft Copilot, with pro-code solution development using Azure OpenAI. So we work with organizations to build out custom AI solutions, as well as building out things such as Microsoft Fabric, data warehousing solutions, and Power BI reporting and dashboards, so that organizations can get the most out of their data. If we can go to the next slide, please, Dave. Okay, excellent. So who are we? So my name's Steve Glasspool. So I actually head up the consulting team here at Valto. A consultant's role is essentially to come into organizations and actually work with the organization to understand their direction of travel, understand the ways they're currently working, understand what they want to improve moving forward, and make recommendations as to how we can improve that and how we can work with the company. So we deliver our workshops, and that's the key area that I look after. I'll hand over quickly to Dave to introduce himself.
Cool, just flicking my face over, but yeah, here Hi, I'm Dave. I'm the Power Platform lead here at Valto. So I've been working in sort of the Power Platform space for around 7 years now, most of that time alongside Steve actually as well. So as a technical lead at Valto, I work very closely with both the consultancy and the development team. So I kind of bridge the gap between what the consultants are looking to sort of elicit in terms of requirements, and then actually implementing that from a technical perspective. So working with our other developers within the team to make sure that those are not only achievable, but they are built in a quality way. So that's basically what I do. I'll pass back over to Steve.
Perfect, thank you, David. If we can just head to the next slide and we'll jump straight in. Awesome. Okay, so initially we're just going to talk about what comes first before we actually start building out an application. And one of the key areas is gathering the requirements, actually eliciting the requirements from the organization as to what needs to be built. One key way of thinking about this is, ensuring you actually have a set of goals, a set of business objectives as to what you want to achieve. For example, there's no point building a car if actually what you're after is a bike. Okay, so one of the key things is looking at what needs to be delivered. Okay, to do that, we look at a few different various areas. Okay, so we are going to look at the different business need. We're going to look at the scope of the business, so what they're looking to achieve. So it could well be they're looking to manage their documents in a slightly better way. It could well be that they're looking to have auditable data around accidents and incidents. So various different types of business goals that are needed and business objectives that need to be met from a very high level. One way that we can actually map that out is looking at putting together a little bit of an elevator pitch. And what we mean by an elevator pitch is we essentially imagine that we get on at the first floor and our managing director may be in the elevator with us at the time. And we've got until they get out on the 5th floor to actually tell them, what we're looking to deliver, what we're looking to achieve. So we need to make it very swift, very concise, and actually hit all the kind of key points initially. So I actually threw something into Copilot prior to this webinar, and this was around an accident and incident tracking system. So I asked Copilot to give me something that was quite concise around delivering a system to that level, and this is what it's given me as an elevator pitch. So imagine a seamless accident and incident tracking system built within Power Apps and SharePoint, leveraging your existing 365 licenses. This solution offers real-time reporting, streamlined workflows, and enhanced data security, all within the familiar Microsoft ecosystem. Empower your team with intuitive tools to ensure compliance, improve safety, satisfy regulations, and drive efficiency, even whilst on site using your mobile and tablet devices. So hopefully 5 floors haven't quite passed in that time, and I've told my managing director exactly what I'm looking to get out of the system. And this is a really good place to start when we're looking to define requirements, because off the back of this, we can then actually identify various different requirements that need to be picked up from actually within that elevator pitch. So we know we need real-time reporting, we know we need to use mobile and tablet devices, we know we need to satisfy regulations, etc. So we can start to expand that elevator pitch. But it's difficult to get into the requirements unless you know what the key goal and objective is that you're looking to achieve. Now, the way we go about grabbing requirements are a few various different tool sets that we use. I mentioned very briefly earlier that as a consultancy team, we deliver workshops. So there are scoping workshops. And those scoping workshops are very much like a little bit of a focus group, getting a team of people together. And some of them are actually more like interviews where we might have an individual stakeholder within the room. Now, typically when you're talking with teams have a little bit more time to talk with you, but you might be talking to people that don't have much time in the business, like the managing director, like the CEO, and that's where an interview can come into place to understand exactly what they need out of the system. And they might have 2 or 3 real big hitter items that they require. We then have the option to look at documents and desk-based analysis. And essentially, this is when we sit down as a consultancy team and we look through materials that have been shared with us. So these might be existing policy or process diagrams, it might be existing templates, it might be recordings of ways of currently, using the system, for example. So they're things that we'll start looking at actually outside of being with the organization and start putting together requirements based on the ways people are currently working and identify things such as maybe bottlenecks in processes, double entry of data, too many handoffs of data, etc. We have the option around user feedback and surveys. This is very much aligned with things like if you're building out kind of intranets or you're replacing existing systems in the business. Obviously, if you're looking to build a new system that replaces something that already exists, it's worth asking the questions about, well, what do you want that new system to do? And the best people to answer those are your day-to-day users. So this allows you to get a large quantity of data. So whereas the scoping workshop and the desk-based analysis might be a bit more quality data, you can get a larger quantity if you're starting to use feedback and surveys. So sometimes we do those initially, and that then helps us ask the right questions when we go into the scoping workshops. Okay. Finally, we might observe the processes that take place. Now, this might be within the workshop, and this will be where we actually look at the system, how it's currently used, and understand it end to end. So if, for example, we're looking at building a car, we can see everything from initial design through to the car driving off the forecourt and understand all the steps that happen within it, and then start making recommendations of how those steps can be improved. So let's use a model-driven app instead of using 20 different Excel sheets, for example. Okay. Next slide, please, Dave. Excellent. So when we start gathering these requirements, we can then start looking at user stories. So user stories are essentially a way of formatting the different requirements. So as you can see on the screen there, there's quite a simplified way to put a user story together. What we want to say is, as a user or as a particular role in the business, I want a specific goal or objective to happen so that I get a specific reason or a specific benefit off the back of that. So that's essentially a framework that we can use for all the various different requirements to make sure they're all written in a very similar way, and to allow people to kind of understand what we're looking to achieve off the back of those user stories. So we've got an example one on the screen as well. So as a compliance manager, I want to track corrective action statuses so that I can update external auditors. So this is actually a live user story that we've got from one of our corrective action and preventative action systems that we've deployed to an organization. So again, very clear and concise. We know who the person is that wants this, we know what they want, and we know the reason why they want it. You also see an acronym on the screen there, which is known as INVEST. And this is a way to make sure your user stories are good user stories. Okay, so that is for them to be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. Now, what that means is that initially, from them being independent, is that developers should be able to implement the story in any kind of sequence that they want. So there shouldn't be too many dependencies. So you can have various different user stories, and they should all be very self-contained. We say they're negotiable because they shouldn't have lots of detail into place. They should be slightly flexible in terms of the way that they can be developed. So like the one we've got there, I want to track corrective action statuses. It doesn't specifically say exactly how I'm going to do it, but it says what I'm going to do. So we can negotiate whether that's in a model-driven app, whether it's in a Canvas app, whether it's in an Excel sheet, for example. They need to be valuable. So we need a reason to have them. They need to be valuable to the project. We're not just writing them down for the sake of it. If we want the app to be red, there has to be an important reason for it to be red, not just because we like the color. It's not very valuable to what we're building out. They need to be estimatable. So of course, the user stories will get passed to someone like Dave on the call in the development team to actually estimate and put efforts against that user story so that we can actually plan that effectively, and we know how much time we can fit them into our various sprints, our various milestones, etc. They need to be small. So in terms of smaller user stories, we can estimate them in a much easier way. We want to be cautious that you don't have a user story that has 50 or 60 different requirements in one, because actually that's very difficult to estimate. So we need to keep them small. And finally, we need to make sure that they're testable. Essentially, everyone that reads the user story should then be able to easily understand what tests would be needed, what the definition of done for that item would be, and what the acceptance criteria for it is. So again, the user story you've got on the screen, I want to track corrective action statuses so I can update external auditors. Well, I've already got some acceptance criteria there because I want to be able to make sure that I've got statuses that I can select from. I want to make sure I've got corrective actions that I can select from. I want to make sure there's a view that I can show my auditors and likely sort and filter them by the different statuses that I have there. So that one little user story then grows into much more acceptance criteria that I can use. If we next look at the low-level design on the next slide, please, Dave. So when we look at low-level design, essentially everything we've talked about thus far is being quite high level. We now need to look into a little bit more of the detail, and this again is where in Valto a lot of our development team come into this space, a lot more to work with the consultants in terms of how we're actually going to build something, how we're going to make sure it's efficient, make sure it's effective, make sure it meets the needs of those user stories. So as an example here, I've got a different a different user story for low-level design. So I've said as a document controller, I want to send documents for approval so that I can confirm updates to a later published major version. So this is based on the Valto controlled document system. This is based on moving documents from a file share into SharePoint and using all the great version history and approval processes and workflows that are available there. But you can see I've also listed out some questions that are in place there from a low-level design. So what technology are we going to use? Now, of course, we're a Microsoft house, so we're going to immediately look at using Power Automate. But this might be an organization that works on various different technologies, so there might be something else they decide to use. We need to know how many approvers there's going to be. Is it a single approver? Is there going to be multiple approvers? Are they going to be in security groups, or are they going to be named individuals? Are we going to send that in a serial order, one at a time? So I send it to Dave. If Dave approves it, it goes to his manager. If he rejects it, his manager never sees it. Or is it going to be parallel in that it goes to Dave and his manager at the same time? If it goes to both of them at the same time, are we going to have it that they both have to approve it? Or is it the first come, first serve? So all of these details need to come out into the low-level design. So immediately we've got a couple of sentences that tells us the what, but the low-level design needs to tell us the how. And this is a real important document that we use so that we can go and get sign-off from our customers to ensure that exactly what we're going to deliver, how we're going to deliver that, and the technology we use is all agreed with within the efforts and the estimates of the product that we're looking to build. Next slide, please, Dave. So a final little point that we look at doing initially in terms of going into the build is looking at wireframes. So of course, wireframes are really critical in terms of showcasing what an application is going to look like. You've probably heard the comment various times before where they say a picture is worth more than 1,000 words, and that's exactly right when it comes to this application development. We can try and write lots of detail about these wireframes that are on the screen, where we want the boxes, what color we want the boxes, what data we want to show. We're going to have a lot of that stuff coming from user stories and from low-level design, but a picture makes it very clear and very obvious. Okay. A wireframe also can be used as a little bit of a proof of concept. So in terms of these images that we've got on the screen, we could actually build it out in such a way, let's say using a tool like Figma, in which we can click those buttons and they open up other screens as well, and we can see the kind of user journey. What that then means is that we can actually check the user experience. We can check we're not missing any pages. We can check we're not missing any features. We can check that we're happy that things work on tablet devices and mobile devices. So we've got lots of different options there to make sure that, a client, for instance, who might not understand fully the technical speak of what's going behind the scenes of building the application, can come in and review that and say that's exactly what we want it to do, and we're happy with that before we go into the build. It also means there's a lot more cost effective to change a picture than it is to actually redevelop a solution. Okay, so at least at a wireframe stage, you can make changes, you can identify if there's anything missing, and you can update things in a lot quicker time frame than it is building out an application and then realizing that that needs to be rebuilt because something was missed during the stage in requirements elicitation moving forward. So next up, we want to pass on to Dave. And Dave, if you bring yourself onto the screen and you can start talking through the development side of Power Platform and well architected, if you may.
Sure. Cheers for that, Steve. Unfortunately, I'm just going to have to hide your beautiful face while I put mine on the screen. There we go. Hopefully, everyone should now be able to see and hear me okay. So basically, everything that Steve was talking about is kind of an extension of what is called the Power Platform well-architected framework, which is produced by Microsoft and actually based off of a previous framework based on Azure. And it's got 5 pillars. So those pillars are reliability, security, operational excellence, performance efficiency, and experience optimization. And essentially, the framework is a set of best practices that you can implement as either a citizen developer or sort of a professional like myself. And the goals are to produce successful designs, because a successful or a well-architected design leads to a successful execution. And you get a lot of confidence in outcomes. If you align everything that you do in development to one of these pillars, then you can be very confident in the outcome that you're going to or you're looking to achieve. And that's because this framework has actually been tested against a wide variety of different organizations. So they already know that this is a tried and tested solution. The pillars are also in place to help you identify trade-offs. So you might want to be implementing the most reliable and the most secure system, but based off of that, potentially the performance might degrade slightly because it's got to jump through more hoops. So these are all things that you've got to consider when trying to develop sort of a well-rounded system. You've also got to understand that this is an iterative framework. So it's not just an upfront done once design framework. You need to ensure that what you're doing is checking at various different milestones throughout the project that the pillars are being aligned to, because it's quite often that you might build a design to start with, things change further down development, or there's new requirements that need sort of fitting into the mix, and then you end up actually sort of not really abiding by potentially the experience optimization or the performance efficiency. So one of those pillars gets a bit of degraded performance. But helpfully for Microsoft, as you can see on the link on the screen, they've provided all of the documentation for you. Now there's an absolute abundance of information there. There's design principles for each of the pillars, there's checklists, and there's a whole host of other information. And what we're looking to do here in this presentation is just distill down each of the various pillars such that you at least know what they are, and then you can go away and do a little bit more research on them yourself. I'm just going to flick over now, and what we're going to do is we're going to run through each of the various pillars and just give a couple of examples where these sort of, or what you can do to implement those pillars. At the top of each of the slides, you'll see the Microsoft definition. I won't go through and read each of those, but it's useful to know exactly what Microsoft expects for those. So what is meant by reliability within a Power Platform solution? So there's a whole host of things that could go wrong within your solution. So hopefully these things will never happen, but you need to plan for them. So these things could be Microsoft 365 outages, third-party outages, or even people being away from the business. So they could be on holiday or they could be on annual leave. The system needs to not be solely reliant on any one of these things. And if any one of these things goes wrong or is down, the system needs to react in a way that's acceptable for end users to either continue on with their day-to-day or at least be aware that there's an issue with the system and things will be picked up further down the line. So this is inclusive of dealing with failures, notifying either administrative staff or end users of issues, or potentially even going down entirely different logic paths depending on if, I don't know, a third party's down. You might need to just continue on with your process and say this document will be generated at a later date. So things like that. You also want to make sure that for a reliable system, it's also consistent. So you want a consistency where you have the same inputs are always producing the same output. Therefore, your system, you know that you're going to get a reliable outcome. In the scope of the Power Platform, what this could mean is creating queues for multi-stage approval processes, such that if one part of the process fails, so maybe your Power Automate fails at a specific stage, it knows what stage to pick it up from, so it doesn't have to restart that entire multi-stage approval process. Let's say it fails at stage 5 or stage 4, then it can just be picked up where it left off and carried on from there, as opposed to having to waste everyone's time reapproving potentially the same documents, for example. You also want to ensure things such as implementing scope blocks within Power Automate, such that you can capture any errors, notify based off of those errors, and continue to respond to, say, a Canvas app in your Power Automate if something's gone wrong. So that gives you a sort of a brief high-level overview of reliability. But what about security? So I would say that reliability and security, in my opinion, are probably the two most important pillars within the well-architected framework. Now, that's not to say that we need to ignore the other pillars, but these two are potentially the most business critical in regard to sort of if any of these things go wrong, then you're in a lot of trouble, basically. So the Power Platform and Microsoft 365 luckily implements a lot of tools to help with security sort of out of the box. So groups, business units within Dataverse, conditional access within Azure. These are all things that you get with a little bit of sort of configuration pretty much out of the box. But just because the tools are there to be sort of an easy to use doesn't mean that they're necessarily always implemented correctly. You need to ensure that you've got the right security model from the get-go. So you need to ask a certain set of questions. So you need to be asking, how do your security measures stop attackers or unauthorized users from breaking into your workload? How much do your security measures reduce the spread of an attack if it happens? How valuable is the workload to the attacker? And how quickly can you detect and recover from an attack? So these are all questions that you need to be asking when developing a Power Platform solution, and they tie quite closely actually into some of the trade-offs that I'll be talking about a little bit later. So for example, if we look at how valuable is the workload to the attacker, you might be producing a Power Platform solution that is just a generic Q&A form type Canvas app that the information is available to everyone in the organization. You don't necessarily want to be spending weeks or months implementing a security model to protect data that isn't necessarily actually needed to be anonymous or anything like that. So again, that feeds into the trade-off type of things. As well as sort of considering attacks from third parties, you also need to implement internal security. So there might be specific teams that can't see data between the lines. That's where business units and things like that might come in. And another interesting point that I was thinking of whilst actually writing this this slide deck was, particularly within the Power Platform and Power Apps portals, you need to be really, really careful because there's now the option to make available your internal data to unauthenticated external users. So you need to be thinking at every single stage, whether it's third-party attackers, whether it's internal security, or whether it's potentially just your lapse in judgment and exposing that data to the outside world unintentionally. So that's a high-level overview of the security pillar. So now let's have a look at the operational excellence. So this kind of encompasses the whole development practice as a whole. So if you think of your solution, this is where you need to be thinking of coding standards, code reviews, things like that. So for operational excellence within the Power Platform, you want to be making sure that at the very minimum, you've got development, test and live environments and varying different release processes for each of those. Depending on the type of licenses that you've got, you might have deployment pipelines to reduce the human error with sort of exporting and importing manually. But it also goes a little bit further than this. You want to make sure that you've got coding and development standards, not just things. If you've got multiple developers working on a specific solution, you want to ensure that just the little things like naming conventions are things that are held to. You also want to be making sure that you've got regular client or stakeholder check-ins to ensure that requirements are being met. So this refers back to what Steve was talking about with some of the stuff with the low-level designs and requirement elicitations. Once those have been handed over to a team like myself, we then interpret those requirements and we sort of build them in a specific way. But if we've built them in a way that doesn't necessarily align to the client or the stakeholder's vision, then it's pretty useless at the end of the day. So you want to make sure you're upholding excellence by checking in regularly with the stakeholders to ensure that the requirements are being met exactly how they want. And again, there's a set of questions that you need to be asking throughout the process of development within the Power Platform to ensure that you're upkeeping excellence, essentially. And that is, how are you driving continuous improvements and learning from your experience? Do you have development and deployment standards that reduce friction and drive consistency? And is your workload meeting user expectations and requirements? And again, I can't emphasize enough the fact that this is an iterative process. So it might be a case that you're producing an MVP or a phase one or whatever it might be for a client. You need to ensure that each of these pillars or each of the process or the steps that you're following within this process are repeated at every single stage to ensure that you're not missing anything as you're going through development. So we're now on to performance efficiency. So you might be developing an application that's got a really complicated set of business logic, but what you don't want the end user to having to do is sort of sat there twiddling their thumbs whilst there's a loading screen going on in the background. You want to make the user aware that there is a process happening, so you want to be showing those loaders, but you want to try and offload any of that complex logic wherever possible to things such as background tasks or batch operations. There's also things that you can implement in the context of Canvas apps, such as concurrency. You can also, I think I already mentioned, sorry, sort of background tasks. So you can offload a lot of that business logic to Power Automate. You also want to be making sure that you're minimizing the amount of data that you're dealing with at any one time. So particularly within Canvas apps, we already know about delegation and things like that. You want to make sure that you're only dealing with the smallest subset of data possible. So you filter that data down at the source and deal with it there, as opposed to collecting it all in and then maybe filtering. So there's a few other things that we can implement in the context of the Power Platform to improve efficiency. Those are child flows. So within Power Automate, within solutions, you can implement what are called child flows. So for any repeated business logic, you're actually able to sort of put those into a child flow and run them as if they were like miniature functions. So that would reduce the sort of the code replication that you might have within a Power Automate, because you can just offload that to a child function. I already touched on concurrent functions within Canvas apps. So you might want to load in or refresh your data sources concurrently. This can drastically reduce the load times or the start time of an application. I already talked a little bit on background tasks, but does the user actually need any instant feedback, or could that potentially be shoveled off into an approval process? It could be that you have a quite complicated approval matrix. That doesn't necessarily need to be figured out client side. That can be done within a Power Automate approval process. And then, as I mentioned, batch operations, instead of looping over each of the various rows that you've got and then writing or upserting your data source, you can simply use batch functions and offload that to the server, such that the client or the user isn't having to wait for each of those tasks to finish. So that's performance efficiency. And then the final pillar that we've got is experience optimization. So essentially, this is another kind of all-encompassing pillar, because it combines all of the pillars. And it ties in quite heavily to what Steve was mentioning about requirement solicitation and ensuring that the requirements are specific yet also simplistic. We want the overall experience for the user to be essentially as simplistic as it possibly can be. Simplicity helps the users learn the systems, it helps them perform the tasks efficiently, and it helps them achieve their goals with minimal distractions. So you want to make sure that your workloads make it easy for users to essentially complete their tasks. You don't want to make it such that it's not obvious what a user needs to do at the next stage. You need to make it abundantly clear what the next step is in a process. You need to make sure it's definitely clear maybe what fields are required on a form. The clearer things are and the more simplistic they are to utilize, the more return on investment you're going to get, and the higher the user satisfaction at the end of the day. So finally, before we get on to sort of the live demo, I wanted to speak very briefly about some of the trade-offs that you need to consider when abiding by this framework. So I think I touched on some of those points previously. So I think the example I used earlier was that if you want a highly reliable and highly secure system, you might have to take a slight hit when it comes to performance efficiency and experience optimization, because there could be far more hoops that you need to jump through. There could be a lot more security that you need to go through, and that could take a longer time to pass through the system. Equally, you don't want to be investing sort of a large amount of time into maybe, I think the example I used earlier was a Q&A application, where a lot of that information would be publicly available to the wider organization and doesn't necessarily need to be locked down with sort of high security measures. So you need to understand the context of the application that you're building and accept the trade-offs that you may need to make during development. A key point is here during the trade-off stage is potentially when you're producing your low-level design. This is where you need to highlight those trade-offs. You might need to say, okay, in order for us to actually develop this in the most secure and reliable way, we will need to, there is a high likely or a high chance that the loading time is going to be increased by potentially an additional second per page as we do additional security checks. Cool. So I'll now move on to the live demo. So all this is a really simplistic application. Essentially, it's just a Canvas app that speaks to SharePoint as the back end and is within a solution. And for each of the different pillars, I've got something to talk about, and hopefully you can get sort of a rough idea of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about some of these pillars. So I'm just going to go now and get up to my lovely design that I've produced here. I thought I was trying to be nice and artistic, but it doesn't actually look that great. But if we go through each of these now and look at the reliability section as to start with, I've produced a very simple Power Automate here. And if you've never worked in Power Automate before, don't worry. It's essentially just you can think of this as a flow chart for the designer. But if you remember earlier in the demonstration or earlier in the talk, sorry, I referred to implementing scope blocks. And I think this is a really good best practice to implement in any of your Power Automate processes that you're doing. So essentially, you've got your try, catch, and finally scope blocks. Now, your try block here would potentially contain the majority of your business logic. This could be broken out into several different scope blocks, but just for this instance, all I'm doing is I'm sending an email out to notify a user that someone's submitted some evidence. Now, there's nothing else you need to do here. You can continue on with your Power Automate exactly as you would, but we've also got the concept of this catch scope block here. Now, I've got this set up to have sort of run after conditions configured for the previous step, meaning that if my try block either fails or is timed out, then I'm going to run this section. You can almost think of it as sort of a miniature function. Now, all I've got in here for the time being, for simplicity's sake, is I've got an action here to say I might be doing some logging. So this could be either a log to a SharePoint list, a Dataverse table, or application insights. And also an email, I've got it set just to send to myself, basically saying the flow's failed, something's gone wrong. This might be going out to either a support team, the IT team, or it could even be sending an email out to the user who triggered the process to say, okay, this has failed. Now, this isn't a one size fits all. There's various different approaches to this, and there is also drawbacks to this because, of course, my try block here could have failed, but then what happens if my catch block fails as well? So you might end up in a never-ending cycle of things going wrong here, but hopefully your business logic is broken down in a way that means that it's grouped down per almost function, if you will, such that only the catch block is left, and that's very unlikely to fail. And then what we've got is we've got our finally block. So what this is here is if we look at our run after conditions, I want this to run whether my error or my catching area is successful, has failed, is skipped, or has timed out. So I want it to run regardless of whether I've failed, I've succeeded, anything's gone on within the solution. And all this is then doing is it's responding to my Canvas app, which might be triggering this Power Automate process, just to let it know that, yeah, there might have been an error, but I've still responded. The whole system hasn't fallen down just because one of my previous logic blocks has. And what we can do here is we can respond to the Canvas app to say, okay, it was successful or it has failed at X, Y, and Z stage. And then there could be a notification within the Canvas app itself to say, yeah, there's been a failure, but this is why. And that again ties into what I was mentioning about making the user aware in the earlier stages within reliability. So that gives you a very high level example of how that could be implemented for reliability. And then if we look at operational excellence, I'm just going to flip over now to Azure DevOps. Now, it doesn't necessarily matter which sort of source control you use, but I highly recommend that as well as implementing dev, test and live environments, you're making regular backups of your solutions. So as you can see here, I've got my well architected repository here. I've got a solution and I've got the various managed and unmanaged versions of my code. I've also got a change log, which I've written down here, as well as a README. And this means that if, God forbid, for whatever reason, you aren't able to back up things, I know that you're unable to necessarily back up the default environment at times, then you've got a sort of a hard copy of it saved elsewhere. There might also be deployment instructions in the code repository, as well as tags for the various different releases that you're doing, such that at any point in time you can easily revert back to a different version of the solution. Or if a bug was made present between 1 and 1.1, you can quickly spin up a new developer environment, go back to version 1 or 1.1 and see exactly what was implemented to make this bug exist, and if it didn't exist before, what's changed since then. You've also want to be making sure that everything that you develop within the Power Platform is built within a solution. So as you can see here, I've got my solution with all of its components. I've got a connection. I've got 2 environment variables. I've got the flow that I was just demonstrating, as well as my Canvas app. And you'll notice here that you want to be abiding by sort of specific naming conventions. So for my connections and my environment variables, I've got sort of it appended with con or env, and then I've kind of said what the connection is, and I said that it connects to a SharePoint list or a SharePoint site. I've also got the name of the flow here, and I've got it appended with Valto, such that I know that it's us that's developed it. And Canvas apps, it's a little bit difficult because sometimes you want the display name of the application to display at the top of the page. And if you had a specific naming convention, such as the Valto underscore, that might look a little bit messy. But these are the kind of things that I mean when I refer to operational excellence. So there's no bounds to this. You can define your own set of standards within operational excellence, or you can abide simply by what they've got within the well-architected framework. But if we go ahead and we look at some more examples of what I've got here, in each of the various pages that I've got, what I'm going to show you is a bit of a bad example, plus hopefully a slightly better example. As I mentioned, each of these examples is very simplistic, and it's only making it slightly better. It can be, as I said, it's an iterative approach. These things can always be improved. So the bad example, what I've got here is I'm loading in all of my data. It's got no security in it, i.e. it's not filtered based off of the current user, and I'm able to see other people's submissions. Now this might be not good if you're looking at people's expenses, for example, or their leave requests. You want to ensure that you're not just doing client-side filtering, so you're not just filtering based off of the current signed-in user. You actually want to make sure that that data source has security applied to it, such that if they go to that data source, so you can see I've got a SharePoint site set up here, I'm not actually able to see any of the other data within there. So it's not just filtering, there is actually security applied to the row. So it's row level security that's being applied there. What this then means is that as I pull that data back, in my better example, all it's doing is it's returning the data that's available to me. So there's various different levels of security that you can apply. You want to make sure that you're applying not only client side, but server side security as well. And this goes for all different types of data sources. So as I've just demonstrated, that's just a SharePoint list, but you might actually be implementing this within Dataverse. So there's even more security options within Dataverse. So there's column level security. We've, as I already mentioned, row level security. You can secure things down to access teams and groups, etc. But we won't get into the nitty gritty. It's just giving an example of how it's better to implement both client side and server side security. So I go back here. So we want to ensure that we've got experience optimization. So if I just pull up this other notepad that I've got here, we can see that on the bad example, in my experience optimization, I can submit this form with no data in, the save button's not locked down at all. The evidence bar should probably multi-line, and there's nothing here. The involving section is simply showing me people's IDs. That's a bad end user experience. I select save. There's no notification to tell me that the save has been successful, and also I'm kind of left in a bit of a I'm left not knowing what to do next, because it's just saying I've got no items to display. The save button's still here. I don't really know what's going on. However, you can see on the right hand side here, I've got the notification to the user to see which fields are required. I've got my evidence checklist here. So if I filled this out now, we can see that I can then save the button and it shows me how many characters are remaining for this form to fill out. However, if I bunged in a bunch of lorem ipsum text, you'll see that I'm now unable to save that form based off of the fact that I've gone over the character limit. So I'll just put in this is my evidence, if I can spell, and then once you select save, you'll notice that you've got a simple notification to the end user to tell them that the data has been saved successfully, as well as the form now resets. So this is a much better example of experience optimization for the end user, because they know exactly what to fill out. They're not left confused at the end of it, and they've got much more indication of what they need to do. So the example here is how many characters is required for the evidence field there. So moving on to last but not least, last time I demonstrated this, it actually crashed my browser. So let's hope that this now works for the end user demo. But essentially, you want to make sure that when you're saving data, if you've got a large amount of business logic on the end of this, if I select save here, you want to signify to the user that that data is being saved, potentially with a loader or something equivalent, just so that they know that there's maybe something going on. And you never want to have a loader going on for that long anyway, or you don't want the screen to hang in the way that it just has. An example of this, as I think I touched on earlier, is potentially you've got a really complicated approval matrix that might be sending out approvals to various different people, such as directors, maybe the CTO or someone within finance, based off of a series of business logic. That business logic could be really complicated, and if you do that on save or on button click there, the user could be waiting around for a little while whilst that's actually happening. A much better approach to doing this would be to have the form simply save right away, and have maybe your background task, as I was referring to, so that your Power Automate implement all of that business logic, so the end user isn't necessarily waiting around for something to happen that they're not sure is even going to happen. So as you can see with those two saves, that was a lot quicker. The user there wasn't even a loader that popped up because it happened that quickly. Whereas on the left-hand side, it was trying to perform all of that business logic client side, and it resulted in a much worse end user experience. So I think I've kind of flown through those various different examples there, and they are very, very basic examples, I have to say, but it gives you an understanding of what you might need to do when implementing those various pillars. And as I keep saying, this is an iterative process. So you might say, okay, the performance, I've measured that performance now, it takes 5 seconds. Is there any way that we can improve that performance over sort of in the next release and things like that. So these are just things to consider. There's a lot more within the documentation within the link that I showed within one of the first slides. So just in case you need to refer back to that, it's this URL here. I'll pop it in the chat after. But there's an abundance of information that you can look at yourselves, or Valto can go into more depth with those kind of things as well. And now I think I'll probably pass back over to Steve for him to carry on with the presentation, if that's all right, mate.
Yeah, that'd be perfect, Dave. Yeah, if we can get that back loaded up. But yeah, again, really insightful to see what goes into kind of delivering a quality Power App. And obviously, to your own admission there, that was a very simple kind of demonstration. But that's the key thing that we like to deliver when we deliver quality products to our clients, to our end users. We want to take that well-architected methodology into place. So, as a little bit of a recap, we want to take away kind of all the requirements, the user stories, the journeys, the objectives, the goals, and we want to get that all correct up front. We want to take that into our low-level design, and our low-level design is then going to really define exactly how we're going to build all of the user stories, meet the goals, meet the objectives. And then we want to get into building. But when we get into building, we don't just want to run at it and produce something that, albeit might achieve a goal, but doesn't achieve it in a high performance route, in a for a good usability application. We want to put the well-architected methodology into place to ensure everything end to end runs smoothly for all organizations. So yeah, really great to see that, Dave. So just to start to wrap things up, a couple of things just to share here. It's just around some of the scoping sessions, excuse me, and some of the services that we actually offer in Valto. So I talked very much right at the start about heading up the consultancy team and that we deliver workshops. So here is one such workshop that we've shared on the screen. This is in relation to our Power Platform scoping. So this is where Valto actually comes into your organization, spends a day with your organization. Now, this could be on site or it could be remote over Teams, sometimes over a couple of half days if we're delivering this remote. But we go through kind of who we are, who you are as an organization, what the objectives, the business goals are for your organization, what you need to produce. We start looking at an overview of what Power Platform will achieve for an organization. So we work with organizations that have only just got Microsoft 365 and don't even know what Power Platform is, to those that actually know that that's what they want, but just don't have the resources to build the application. We start looking at your existing processes, the way you currently work, be it some Excel sheets with lots of emails being sent, with paper-based forms, etc. And then we piece together the journey where you want to go moving forward, and we put those requirements together, and that then leads us to the ability to deliver kind of a fixed price or an agile project with yourselves, and that could be a co-developed project, it could be a project that we just deliver for you. It's all about getting that done and getting that work in place up front as this paid for scoping session. So that's very much our consultancy team that will lead that and work with you. We then also have another service just to share. If we can go to the next slide there, please, Dave. And this is just regarding our health checks. So this is typically with organizations that have already built out one or many applications in the organization. These are organizations that might not have attended webinars like these, have used more citizen developers to build some stuff out, and potentially got to the position where, 60%, 70% of the application is correct, but there's got errors, or they're hitting roadblocks, or they're finding maybe it's slow to save data, or people are saying it's not usable, that kind of thing. And this is where our team will come in and work with you to fully understand the application that's been built, take time out to kind of review that application, and then come back to you with recommendations as to what needs updating, how can it be fixed, and time and effort to get that fixed. That could be something that is done internally, again, is done as co-development, or is done via training, or something that Valto take away and actually deliver for you. So, the well-architected pieces and everything that Dave went through would be something that, when Dave comes along and delivers these sorts of health checks, he'd be going through all of those well-architected pillars and reviewing them against the application that's already in place. So again, a couple of services we offer. We offer various other workshops as well around SharePoint, intranets, building of apps, data and AI, all the pillars we discussed earlier. So if there is anything of interest, anything you're looking at doing moving forward, or support that you need, do reach out to us. Do let us know that you came from this webinar. It's always great to hear that. And then our team can work with you and define what the best next steps are to support. Okay. So if we can just go on to the next slide, I think we just come on to our question slide now, just to wrap things up. So We've had a fair few questions come through, so thanks very much for that. We won't be able to tackle maybe every question in place, but we'll get through a few of these. Again, if there's any question that you've asked that hasn't been answered, do reach out to us separately and we can get that covered for you. Okay. So one of the questions actually has come from Liz around how citizen developers fit into everything that we were discussing. Now, that was quite early on in the presentation, so it looks like that's aligned more so with a lot of the user stories and that side of things. So essentially, just to define a citizen developer, this is, individuals within an organization who are maybe not sitting in the IT team, they're not sitting in the development team, and they want to start producing Power Apps for their own area. So you might have a HR citizen developer, you might have a finance citizen developer. And the issue is you want to make sure that they're all aligned with your ways of working. So I guess the key thing as to where this fits in is that you need to take this information and feed that back to those developers. You need to get everyone kind of in a room together, and you need to give them a framework as to how to work. That's from everything from scoping out the application initially and doing your upfront work to making sure the solution is well architected. There's no point having a HR person that doesn't use any naming conventions and a finance person that does use naming conventions, because then when one of them gets into trouble and the IT team maybe comes in to help them, they're working on completely different types of solutions at that point. So you just want to keep everything kind of naturally working in the same way. It's great to have citizen developers out there, but you want to make sure that they're working within your boundaries, within your guardrails that you've set up for them, purely so that they can deliver a quality solution off the back of it. But Dave, anything further to add on that question from your side?
No, I think you've pretty much hit the nail on the head there in regard to citizen developers, and I think with this framework, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you're a professional or you're a citizen developer. The framework is there to work with whoever might be implementing the various solutions. So it doesn't. Citizen developers can follow this process, but it's key that, as you were referring to with the requirement solicitation and the low-level design sections, that those are still occurring internally. So if you've got a citizen developer or a relevant stakeholders within a business, that those various steps within the process are still occurring, irrespective of whether you've hired out a third party or are doing everything internally. That's my thoughts on that.
Excellent, thank you, Dave. And then we've got another question here from Liz, and this is in relation to how we determine what type of Power App we would use based on a particular user story. Now, this is a really interesting question here. Now, if I was to put my business analyst hat on, essentially I'd be saying that, from a user story perspective, they're all technology agnostic. You figure out later what technologies you're going to be using for those user stories. Now, if I put my Microsoft hat back on and I need to configure, which approach we're going to take from maybe a model-driven app to a Canvas app, there's a few kind of highlighted areas that you would look at. So some of it would be like usability. So of course, a Canvas app, you can make something which is obviously a lot more kind of designed for tablet, mobile devices, can make use, of the camera, geolocation features. People find that maybe a bit more easier to use versus a model-driven app, which is a lot more data heavy. So you can take that approach where it's a lot more data heavy. It's maybe not as well designed, simplistic to use, but it's not like fancy loaders or stuff like that happening within there, for instance. You also have the amount of data that you're using, whether you're going to put things into SharePoint lists versus Dataverse. You've got your licensing requirements and budgetary requirements into place. You've got the number of users working on the system. So there's various different things that need to be looked at on an organization case-by-case basis. So some user stories might determine the route that you need to go. And there's been a number of workshops where 80% of the workshop we've been going model-driven app until a few user stories have been thrown in at the end that have switched us to Canvas app or vice versa. But typically, you want to get those user stories down first, be technology agnostic, and then start looking at what the best technologies are based on budgetary requirements, security requirements, look and feel, usability, etc. But again, Dave, have you got anything to mention on that?
No, I think you're pretty much bang on with everything you said there, Steve. I haven't really got much to add to that.
Excellent. And just conscious of time here, so we've got one last question that we can pick up. And Dave, I'll hand this one to you, but just regarding the licensing requirements or any license requirements around anything you've showcased on well-architected solutions.
Yeah, so there isn't really any licensing implications to any of the stuff that I spoke about. All of these things can be implemented at sort of varying levels within the Power Platform. So that's irrespective of what kind of license you've got. Obviously, if we're looking at building, let's say, for example, a Canvas app on top of SharePoint, that wouldn't have the licensing implications or any licensing implications involved, sorry. However, you would be slightly more limited in the set of or in the security model that you'd have versus within Dataverse. So there's a lot more flexibility with security within Dataverse. So that's just one example. But another example I can think of is you can still achieve operational excellence without necessarily having the additional licenses to do pipelines within your business, for example. You can still set up a really good development practice, ensuring that everything's going through relevant code reviews and things like that without having to have sort of that expensive development pipeline and things like that. So none of this, or this is, as the word that Steve was using, this is license agnostic. However, there are tools and licenses that you can utilize, as I referred to with the pipelines and things, that would potentially make your life easier. So it might take the workload off you in aligning to the framework. However, there isn't a necessity to have any additional licenses to abide by the well-architected framework.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. Well, conscious of time, then we've just ticked over 4 o'clock, aware people will probably have end of day meetings to be heading into. So just want to take this time to firstly apologise if we didn't answer your question. Do reach out to us, drop us a line, and we'll try and get those answered for you. Look forward to hopefully hearing from you if there's anything that you want to work through further on the Power Platform, where architected design, look at some of our scoping sessions and our health checks. But otherwise, just to finalise, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening, and this will be up on YouTube if you wish to share it or re-review this.
Cheers, guys. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.